Book 4, Part 1 of Xenofonte's Anábase. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrew Coleman. Anábase by Xenofonte. Translated by H.G. Dakins. Book 4, Part 1. Number 1. It was now about the last watch, and enough of the night remained to allow them to cross the valley under cover of darkness, when, at the word of command, they rose and set off on their march, reaching the mountains at daybreak. At this stage of the march, Charisophus, at the head of his own division, with the whole of the light troops, led the van, while Xenophon followed behind with the heavy infantry of the rearguard, but without any light troops, since there seemed to be no danger of pursuit or attack from the rear, while they were making their way uphill. Charisophus reached the summit without any of the enemy perceiving him. Then he led on slowly, and the rest of the army followed, wave upon wave, cresting the summit and descending into the villages which nestled in the hollows and recesses of the hills. Thereupon the Carduchians abandoned their dwelling places, and with their wives and children fled to the mountains. So there was plenty of provisions to be got for the mere trouble of taking, and the homesteads too were well supplied with a copious store of bronze vessels and utensils, which the Hellenes kept their hands off, abstaining at the same time from all pursuit of the folk themselves, gently handling them, in hopes that the Carduchians might be willing to give them friendly passage through their country, since they too were enemies of the king. Only they helped themselves to such provisions as fell in their way, which indeed was a sheer necessity. But the Carduchians neither gave ear when they called to them, nor showed any other friendly sign. And now, as the last of the Hellenes descended into the villages from the pass, they were already in the dark, since, owing to the narrowness of the road, the whole day had been spent in the ascent and descent. At that instant a party of the Carduchians, who had collected, made an attack on the hindmost men, killing some and wounding others with stones and arrows, though it was quite a small body who attacked. The fact was, the approach of the Hellenic army had taken them by surprise. If, however, they had mustered in larger force at this time, the chances are that a large portion of the army would have been annihilated. As it was, they got into quarters and bivouacked in the villages that night, while the Carduchians kept many watch-fires blazing in a circle on the mountains, and kept each other in sight all round. But with the dawn, the generals and officers of the Hellenes met and resolved to proceed, taking only the necessary number of stout baggage animals, and leaving the weaklings behind. They resolved further to let go free all the lately captured slaves in the host, for the pace of the march was necessarily rendered slow by the quantity of animals and prisoners, and the number of non-combatants in attendance on these was excessive, while, with such a crowd of human beings to satisfy, twice the amount of provisions had to be procured and carried. These resolutions passed, they caused a proclamation by herald to be made for their enforcement. When they had breakfasted and the march recommenced, the generals planted themselves a little to one side in a narrow place, and when they found any of the aforesaid slaves or other property still retained, they confiscated them. The soldiers yielded obedience, except where some smuggler, prompted by desire of a good-looking boy or woman, managed to make off with his prize. During this day, they contrived to get along after a fashion, now fighting and now resting. But on the next day they were visited by a great storm, in spite of which they were obliged to continue the march, owing to insufficiency of provisions. Charisophus was as usual leading in front, while Xenophon headed the rearguard, when the enemy began a violent and sustained attack. At one narrow place after another they came up quite close, pouring in volleys of arrows and sling-stones, so that the Hellenes had no choice but to make sallies in pursuit and then again recoil, making but very little progress. Over and over again Xenophon would send an order to the front to slacken pace, when the enemy were pressing their attack severely. As a rule, when the word was so passed up, Charisophus slackened. But sometimes, instead of slackening, Cheirisophus quickened, sending down a counter-order to the rear to follow on quickly. It was clear that there was something or other happening, but there was no time to go to the front and discover the cause of the hurry. Under the circumstances, the march, at any rate in the rear, became very like a rout, and here a brave man lost his life, Cleonymus the Laconian, shot with an arrow in the ribs right through shield and corselet, as also Basius, an Arcadian, shot clean through the head. As soon as they reached a halting place, Xenophon, without more ado, came up to Cheirisophus and took him to task for not having waited. "Whereby," he said, "we were forced to fight and flee at the same moment, and now it has cost us the lives of 2 fine fellows. They are dead, and we were not able to pick up their bodies or bury them." Cheirisophus answered, "Look up there," pointing as he spoke to the mountain. "Do you see how inaccessible it all is? Only this one road, which you see, going straight up, and on it all that crowd of men who have seized and are guarding the single exit. That is why I hastened on, and why I could not wait for you, hoping to be beforehand with them yonder in seizing the pass. The guides we have got say there is no other way." And Xenophon replied, "But I have got 2 prisoners also. The enemy annoyed us so much that we laid an ambuscade for them, which also gave us time to recover our breaths. We killed some of them, and did our best to catch 1 or 2 alive, for this very reason, that we might have guides who knew the country to depend upon." The 2 were brought up at once, and questioned separately. Did they know of any other road than the one visible? The first said no, and in spite of all sorts of terrors applied to extract a better answer, no, he persisted. When nothing could be got out of him, he was killed before the eyes of his fellow. This latter then explained, "Yonder man said he did not know, because he has got a daughter married to a husband in those parts. I can take you," he added, "by a good road, practicable even for beasts." And when asked whether there was any point on it difficult to pass, he replied that there was a col which it would be impossible to pass unless it were occupied in advance. Then it was resolved to summon the officers of the light infantry, and some of those of the heavy infantry, and to acquaint them with the state of affairs, and ask them whether any of them were minded to distinguish themselves, and would step forward as volunteers on an expedition. 2 or 3 heavy infantry soldiers stepped forward at once, 2 Arcadians, Aristonomus of Methydrium and Agasius of Stymphalus, and in emulation of these, a 3rd, also an Arcadian, Callimachus from Parasia, who said he was ready to go, and would get volunteers from the whole army to join him. "I know," he added, "there will be no lack of youngsters to follow where I lead." After that they asked, were there any captains of light infantry willing to accompany the expedition? Aristeus, a Chian, who on several occasions proved his usefulness to the army on such service, volunteered. Number 2. It was already late afternoon when they ordered the storming party to take a snatch of food and set off. Then they bound the guide and handed him over to them. The agreement was, that if they succeeded in taking the summit, they were to guard the position that night, and at daybreak to give a signal by bugle. At this signal the party on the summit were to attack the enemy in occupation of the visible pass, while the generals with the main body would bring up their succours, making their way up with what speed they might. With this understanding off they set, 2,000 strong, and there was a heavy downpour of rain, but Xenophon, with his rear guard, began advancing to the visible pass, so that the enemy might fix his attention on this road, and the party creeping round might, as much as possible, elude observation. Now when the rear guard, so advancing, had reached a ravine which they must cross in order to strike up the steep, at that instant the barbarians began rolling down great boulders, each a wagon load, some larger, some smaller. Against the rocks they crashed and splintered, flying like sling stones in every direction, so that it was absolutely out of the question even to approach the entrance of the pass. Some of the officers, finding themselves balked at this point, kept trying other ways, nor did they desist till darkness set in, and then, When they thought they would not be seen retiring, they returned to supper. Some of them who had been on duty in the rearguard had had no breakfast, it so happened. However, the enemy never ceased rolling down their stones all through the night, as was easy to infer from the booming sound. The party with the guide made a circuit and surprised the enemy's guards seated round their fire, and after killing some, and driving out the rest, took their places, thinking that they were in possession of the height. As a matter of fact, they were not, for above them lay a breast-like hill, skirted by the narrow road on which they had found the guards seated. Still, from the spot in question there was an approach to the enemy, who were seated on the pass before mentioned. Here then they passed the night, but at the first glimpse of dawn they marched stealthily and in battle order against the enemy. There was a mist, so that they could get quite close without being observed. But as soon as they caught sight of one another, the trumpet sounded, and with a loud cheer they rushed upon the fellows, who did not wait their coming, but left the road and made off, with the loss of only a few lives, however, so nimble were they. Chrysippus and his men, catching the sound of the bugle, charged up by the well-marked road, while others of the generals pushed their way up by pathless routes, where each division chanced to be, the men mounting as they were best able, and hoisting one another up by means of their spears. And these were the first to unite with the party who had already taken the position by storm. Xenophon, with the rearguard, followed the path which the party with the guide had taken, since it was easiest for the beasts of burthen. One half of his men he had posted in rear of the baggage animals, the other half he had with himself. In their course they encountered a crest above the road, occupied by the enemy, whom they must either dislodge or be themselves cut off from the rest of the Hellenes. The men by themselves could have taken the same route as the rest, but the baggage animals could not mount by any other way than this. Here then, with shouts of encouragement to each other, they dashed at the hill with their storming columns, not from all sides, but leaving an avenue of escape for the enemy if he chose to avail himself of it. For a while, as the men scrambled up where each best could, the natives kept up a fire of arrows and darts, yet did not receive them at close quarters, but presently left the position in flight. No sooner, however, were the Hellenes safely past this crest than they came in sight of another in front of them, also occupied, and deemed it advisable to storm it also. But now it struck Xenophon that if they left the ridge just taken unprotected in their rear, the enemy might reoccupy it, and attack the baggage animals as they filed past, presenting a long extended line owing to the narrowness of the road by which they made their way. To obviate this, he left some officers in charge of the ridge: Cephisodorus, son of Cephisophon, an Athenian; Amphicrates, the son of Amphidamas, an Athenian; and Archagoras, an Argive exile, while he in person with the rest of the men attacked the second ridge. This they took in the same fashion, only to find that they had still a third knoll left, far the steepest of the three. This was none other than the Mamelon mentioned as above the outpost, which had been captured over their fire by the volunteer storming party in the night. But when the Hellenes were close, the natives, to the astonishment of all, without a struggle deserted the knoll. It was conjectured that they had left their position from fear of being encircled and besieged, but the fact was that they, from their higher ground, had been able to see what was going on in the rear, and had all made off in this fashion to attack the rearguard. So then Xenophon, with the youngest men, scaled up to the top, leaving orders to the rest to march on slowly, so as to allow the hindmost companies to unite with them. They were to advance by the road, and when they reached the level, to ground arms. Meanwhile, the Argive Archagoras arrived, in full flight, with the announcement that they had been dislodged from the first ridge, and that Cephisodorus and Amphicrates were slain, with a number of others besides, all in fact who had not jumped down the crags and so reached the rearguard. After this achievement, the barbarians came to a crest facing the Mamelon, and Xenophon held a colloquy with them by means of an interpreter, to negotiate a truce, and demanded back the dead bodies. These they agreed to restore if he would not burn their houses, and to these terms Xenophon agreed. Meanwhile, as the rest of the army filed past, and the colloquy was proceeding, all the people of the place had time to gather gradually, and the enemy formed, and as soon as the Hellenes began to descend from the Mamelon to join the others where the troops were halted, on rushed the foe in full force with hue and cry. They reached the summit of the Mamelon from which Xenophon was descending, and began rolling down crags. One man's leg was crushed to pieces. Xenophon was left by his shield-bearer, who carried off his shield, but Eurylochus of Lucia, an Arcadian hoplite, ran up to him and threw his shield in front to protect both of them. So the two together beat a retreat, and so too the rest, and joined the serried ranks of the main body. After this, the whole Hellenic force united, and took up their quarters there in numerous beautiful dwellings, with an ample store of provisions; for there was wine so plentiful that they had it in cemented cisterns. Xenophon and Charisophus arranged to recover the dead, and in return restored the guide. Afterwards they did everything for the dead, according to the means at their disposal, with the customary honours paid to good men. Next day they set off without a guide, and the enemy, by keeping up a continuous battle and occupying in advance every narrow place, obstructed passage after passage. Accordingly, whenever the van was obstructed, Xenophon, from behind, made a dash up the hills and broke the barricade, and freed the vanguard by endeavouring to get above the obstructing enemy. Whenever the rear was the point attacked, Charisophus in the same way made a detour, and by endeavouring to mount higher than the barricaders, freed the passage for the rear rank. And in this way, turn and turn about, they rescued each other, and paid unflinching attention to their mutual needs. At times it happened that, the relief party having mounted, encountered considerable annoyance in their descent from the barbarians, who were so agile that they allowed them to come up quite close before they turned back and still escaped, partly no doubt because the only weapons they had to carry were bows and slings. They were, moreover, excellent archers, using bows nearly 3 cubits long and arrows more than 2 cubits. When discharging the arrow, they draw the string by getting a purchase with the left foot planted forward on the lower end of the bow. The arrows pierced through shield and cuirass, and the Hellenes, when they got hold of them, used them as javelins, fitting them to their thongs. In these districts the Cretans were highly serviceable. They were under the command of Stratocles, a Cretan. When the generals heard this news, they resolved to collect the troops, and they set off at once, taking the prisoner to act as guide, and leaving a garrison behind with Sophonitus the Stymphalian in command of those who remained in the camp. As soon as they had begun to cross the hills, the light infantry, advancing in front and catching sight of the camp, did not wait for the heavy infantry, but with a loud shout rushed upon the enemy's entrenchment. The natives, hearing the din and clatter, did not care to stop, but took rapidly to their heels. But, for all their expedition, some of them were killed, and as many as 20 horses were captured, with the tent of Tiribazus and its contents, silver-footed couches and goblets, besides certain persons styling themselves the butlers and bakers. As soon as the generals of the heavy infantry division had learnt the news, they resolved to return to the camp with all speed, for fear of an attack being made on the remnant left behind. The recall was sounded, and the retreat commenced. The camp was reached the same day. End of Book 4, Part 1. Book 4, Part 2 of Xenophon's Anábasis. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrew Coleman. Anábasis by Xenophon. Translated by H.G. Dakins. Book 4, Part 2. Number 3. During this day they bivouacked in the villages which lie above the plain of the river Contrites, which is about 200 feet broad. It is the frontier river between Armenia and the country of the Carduchians. Here the Hellenes recruited themselves, and the sight of the plain filled them with joy, for the river was but 6 or 7 furlongs distant from the mountains of the Carduchians. For the moment, then, they bivouacked right happily. They had their provisions. They had also many memories of the labours that were now past. seeing that the last 7 days spent in traversing the country of the Carduchians had been one long continuous battle, which had cost them more suffering than the whole of their troubles at the hands of the king and Tissaphernes put together. As though they were truly quit of them for ever, they laid their heads to rest in sweet content. But with the morrow's dawn they espied horsemen at a certain point across the river, armed cap a pie, as if they meant to dispute the passage. Infantry too, drawn up in line upon the banks above the cavalry, threatened to prevent them debouching into Armenia. These troops were Armenian and Mardian and Chaldean mercenaries belonging to Orontas and Artuchas. The last of the three, the Chaldeans, were said to be a free and brave set of people. They were armed with long wicker shields and lances. The banks before named on which they were drawn up were 100 yards or more distant from the river, and the single road which was visible was one leading upwards and looking like a regular artificially constructed highway. At this point the Hellenes endeavoured to cross, but on their making the attempt the water proved to be more than breast deep, and the river bed was rough with great slippery stones, and as to holding their arms in the water, it was out of the question. The stream swept them away, or if they tried to carry them over the head, the body was left exposed to the arrows and other missiles. Accordingly, they turned back and encamped there by the bank of the river. At the point where they had themselves been last night, up on the mountains, they could see the Carduchians collected in large numbers and under arms. A shadow of deep despair again descended on their souls, whichever way they turned their eyes. In front lay the river so difficult to ford, over on the other side a new enemy threatening to bar the passage, on the hills behind the Carduchians ready to fall upon their rear should they once again attempt to cross. Thus for this day and night they halted, sunk in perplexity. But Xenophon had a dream. In his sleep he thought that he was bound in fetters, but these, of their own accord, fell from off him, so that he was loosed and could stretch his legs as freely as he wished. So, at the first glimpse of daylight, he came to Chrysippus and told him that he had hopes that all things would go well, and related to him his dream. The other was well pleased, and with the first faint gleam of dawn the generals all were present and did sacrifice, and the victims were favourable in the first essay. Retiring from the sacrifice, the generals and officers issued an order to the troops to take their breakfasts, and while Xenophon was taking his, 2 young men came running up to him, for everyone knew that, breakfasting or supping, he was always accessible, or that even if asleep anyone was welcome to awaken him who had anything to say bearing on the business of war. What the 2 young men had at this time to say was that they had been collecting brushwood for fire, and had presently espied on the opposite side, in among some rocks which came down to the river's brink, an old man and some women and little girls depositing, as it would appear, bags of clothes in a cavernous rock. When they saw them, it struck them that it was safe to cross. In any case, the enemy's cavalry could not approach at this point. So they stripped naked, expecting to have to swim for it, and with their long knives in their hands began crossing, but going forward crossed without being wet up to the fork. Once across, they captured the clothes and came back again. Accordingly, Xenophon at once poured out a libation himself, and bade the 2 young fellows fill the cup and pray to the gods, who showed to him this vision and to them a passage, to bring all other blessings for them to accomplishment. When he had poured out the libation, he at once led the 2 young men to Chrysippus, and they repeated to him their story. Chrysippus, on hearing it, offered libations also, and when they had performed them, they sent a general order to the troops to pack up ready for starting, while they themselves called a meeting of the generals and took counsel how they might best effect a passage, so as to overpower the enemy in front without suffering any loss from the men behind. And they resolved that Chrysippus should lead the van and cross with half the army, the other half still remaining behind under Xenophon, while the baggage animals and the mob of sutlers were to cross between the two divisions. When all was duly ordered, the move began, the young men pioneering them, and keeping the river on their left. It was about 4 furlongs' march to the crossing, and as they moved along the bank, the squadrons of cavalry kept pace with them on the opposite side. But when they had reached a point in a line with the ford, and the cliff-like banks of the river, they grounded arms, and first Chrysippus himself placed a wreath upon his brows, and throwing off his cloak, resumed his arms, passing the order to all the rest to do the same, and bade the captains form their companies in open order in deep columns, some to left and some to right of himself. Meanwhile the soothsayers were slaying a victim over the river, and the enemy were letting fly their arrows and sling-stones, but as yet they were out of range. As soon as the victims were favourable, all the soldiers began singing the battle hymn, and with the notes of the paean mingled the shouting of the men, accompanied by the shriller chant of the women, for there were many women in the camp. So Chrysippus with his detachment stepped in, but Xenophon, taking the most active body of the rearguard, began running back at full speed to the passage facing the egress into the hills of Armenia, making a feint of crossing at that point to intercept their cavalry on the river bank. The enemy, seeing Chrysippus's detachment easily crossing the stream, and Xenophon's men racing back, were seized with the fear of being intercepted, and fled at full speed in the direction of the road which emerges from the stream. But when they were come opposite to it, they raced uphill towards their mountains. Then Lycias, who commanded the cavalry, and Aeschines, who was in command of the division of light infantry attached to Chrysippus, no sooner saw them fleeing so lustily than they were after them, and the soldiers shouted not to fall behind, but to follow them right up to the mountains. Chrysippus, on getting across, forbore to pursue the cavalry, but advanced by the bluffs which reached to the river, to attack the enemy overhead, and these, seeing their own cavalry fleeing, seeing also the heavy infantry advancing upon them, abandoned the heights above the river. Xenophon, as soon as he saw that things were going well on the other side, fell back with all speed to join the troops engaged in crossing, for by this time the Carduchians were well in sight, descending into the plain to attack their rear. Chrysippus was in possession of the higher ground, and Lycias, with his little squadron, in an attempt to follow up the pursuit, had captured some stragglers of their baggage-bearers, and with them some handsome apparel and drinking cups. The baggage animals of the Hellenes and the mob of non-combatants were just about to cross, when Xenophon turned his troops right about to face the Carduchians. Vis-à-vis he formed his line, passing the order to the captains each to form his company into sections, and to deploy them into line by the left, the captains of companies and lieutenants in command of sections to advance to meet the Carduchians, while the rear leaders would keep their position facing the river. But when the Carduchians saw the rearguard so stripped of the mass, and looking now like a mere handful of men, they advanced all the more quickly, singing certain songs the while. Then, as matters were safe with him, Chrysippus sent back the peltasts and slingers and archers to join Xenophon, with orders to carry out his instructions. They were in the act of recrossing, when Xenophon, who saw their intention, sent a messenger across, bidding them wait there at the river's brink without crossing. But as soon as he and his detachment began to cross, they were to step in facing him in 2 flanking divisions, right and left of them, as if in the act of crossing, the javelin men with their javelins on the thong, and the bowmen with their arrows on the string, but they were not to advance far into the stream. The order passed to his own men was, "Wait till you are within slingshot, and the shield rattles, then sound the paean, and charge the enemy. As soon as he turns, and the bugle from the river sounds for the attack, you will face about to the right, the rear rank leading, and the whole detachment falling back and crossing the river as quickly as possible, everyone preserving his original rank, so as to avoid trammelling one another. The bravest man is he who gets to the other side first." The Carduchians, seeing that the remnant left was the merest handful, for many, even of those whose duty it was to remain, had gone off in their anxiety to protect their beasts of burden, or their personal kit, or their mistresses, bore down upon them valorously, and opened fire with sling-stones and arrows. But the Hellenes, raising the battle hymn, dashed at them at a run, and they did not await them, armed well enough for mountain warfare, and with a view to sudden attack followed by speedy flight. They were not by any means sufficiently equipped for an engagement at close quarters. At this instant the signal of the bugle was heard. Its notes added wings to the flight of the barbarians. But the Hellenes turned right about in the opposite direction, and betook themselves to the river with what speed they might. Some of the enemy, here a man and there another, perceived, and running back to the river, let fly their arrows and wounded a few, but the majority, even when the Hellenes were well across, were still to be seen pursuing their flight. The detachment which came to meet Xenophon's men, carried away by their valour, advanced further than they had need to, and had to cross back again in the rear of Xenophon's men, and of these too a few were wounded. Number 4. The passage effected, they fell into line about midday, and marched through Armenian territory, one long plain with smooth rolling hillocks, not less than 5 parasangs in distance, for owing to the wars of this people with the Carduchians, there were no villages near the river. The village eventually reached was large, and possessed a palace belonging to the satrap, and most of the houses were crowned with turrets. Provisions were plentiful. From this village they marched 2 stages, 10 parasangs, until they had surmounted the sources of the river Tigris, and from this point they marched 3 stages, 15 parasangs, to the river Teleboas. This was a fine stream, though not large, and there were many villages about it. The district was named Western Armenia. The lieutenant governor of it was Tiribazus, the king's friend, and whenever the latter paid a visit, he alone had the privilege of mounting the king upon his horse. This officer rode up to the Hellenes with a body of cavalry, and sending forward an interpreter, stated that he desired a colloquy with the leaders. The generals resolved to hear what he had to say, and advancing on their side to within speaking distance, they demanded what he wanted. He replied that he wished to make a treaty with them, in accordance with which he on his side would abstain from injuring the Hellenes, if they would not burn his houses, but merely take such provisions as they needed. This proposal satisfied the generals, and a treaty was made on the terms suggested. From this place they marched 3 stages, 15 parasangs, through plain country, Tiribazus the while keeping close behind with his own forces more than a mile off. Presently they reached a palace with villages clustered round about it, which were full of supplies in great variety. But while they were encamping in the night, there was a heavy fall of snow, and in the morning it was resolved to billet out the different regiments, with their generals, throughout the villages. There was no enemy in sight, and the proceeding seemed prudent, owing to the quantity of snow. In these quarters they had for provisions all the good things there are: sacrificial beasts, corn, old wines with an exquisite bouquet, dried grapes, and vegetables of all sorts. But some of the stragglers from the camp reported having seen an army, and the blaze of many watch-fires in the night. Accordingly, the generals concluded that it was not prudent to separate their quarters in this way, and a resolution was passed to bring the troops together again. After that they reunited, the more so that the weather promised to be fine with a clear sky. But while they lay there in open quarters, during the night down came so thick a fall of snow that it completely covered up the stacks of arms and the men themselves lying down. It cramped and crippled the baggage animals, and there was great unreadiness to get up, so gently fell the snow as they lay there warm and comfortable, and formed a blanket, except where it slipped off the sleepers' shoulders, and it was not until Xenophon roused himself to get up, and, without his cloak on, began to split wood, that quickly first one, and then another got up, and taking the log away from him, fell to splitting. Thereat the rest followed suit, got up and began kindling fire and oiling their bodies, for there was a scented unguent to be found there in abundance, which they used instead of oil. It was made from pig's fat, sesame, bitter almonds, and turpentine. There was a sweet oil also to be found, made of the same ingredients. After this, it was resolved that they must again separate their quarters and get under cover in the villages. At this news the soldiers, with much joy and shouting, rushed upon the covered houses and the provisions; but all who in their blind folly had set fire to the houses when they left them before, now paid the penalty in the poor quarters they got. From this place one night they sent off a party under Democritus, a Temenite, up into the mountains where the stragglers reported having seen watch-fires. The leader selected was a man whose judgment might be depended upon to verify the truth of the matter. With a happy gift to distinguish between fact and fiction, he had often been successfully appealed to. He went and reported that he had seen no watch-fires, but he had got a man, whom he brought back with him, carrying a Persian bow and quiver, and a cigaris or battle-axe like those worn by the Amazons. When asked from what country he came, the prisoner answered that he was a Persian, and was going from the army of Tiribazus to get provisions. They next asked him how large the army was, and for what object it had been collected. His answer was that it consisted of Tiribazus at the head of his own forces, and aided by some Chalybian and Tauchian mercenaries. Tiribazus had got it together, he added, meaning to attack the Hellenes on the high mountain pass, in a defile which was the sole passage. End of Book 4, Part 2. Book 4, Part 3 of Xenofonte's Anábase. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrew Coleman. Anábase by Xenophon, translated by H.G. Dakins. Book 4, Part 3. Number 5. The next day it was resolved that they should set off with all possible speed, before the enemy had time to collect and occupy the defile. Having got their kit and baggage together, they at once began their march through deep snow with several guides, and, crossing the high pass the same day on which Tiribazus was to have attacked them, got safely into cantonments. From this point they marched 3 desert stages, 15 parasangs, to the river Euphrates, and crossed it in water up to the waist. The sources of the river were reported to be at no great distance. From this place they marched through deep snow over a flat country 3 stages, 15 parasangs. The last of these marches was trying, with the north wind blowing in their teeth, drying up everything and benumbing the men. Here one of the seers suggested to them to do sacrifice to Boreas, and sacrifice was done. The effect was obvious to all, in the diminished fierceness of the blast. But there was 6 feet of snow, so that many of the baggage animals and slaves were lost, and about 30 of the men themselves. They spent the whole night in kindling fire, for there was fortunately no dearth of wood at the halting place. Only those who came late into camp had no wood. Accordingly, those who had arrived a good while, and had kindled fires, were not for allowing these late-comers near the fires, unless they would in return give a share of their corn, or of any other victuals they might have. Here then a general exchange of goods was set up. Where the fire was kindled the snow melted, and great trenches formed themselves down to the bare earth, and here it was possible to measure the depth of the snow. Leaving these quarters, they marched the whole of the next day over snow, and many of the men were afflicted with bulimia, or hunger faintness. Xenophon, who was guarding the rear, came upon some men who had dropped down, and he did not know what ailed them. But some one who was experienced in such matters suggested to him that they had evidently got bulimia, and if they got something to eat, they would revive. Then he went the round of the baggage train, and laying an embargo on any eatables he could see, doled out with his own hands, or sent off other able-bodied agents to distribute to the sufferers, who as soon as they had taken a mouthful, got on their legs again, and continued the march. On and on they marched, and about dusk Chrysippus reached a village, and surprised some women and girls who had come from the village to fetch water at the fountain outside the stockade. These asked them who they were. The interpreters answered for them in Persian, they were on their way from the king to the satrap, in reply to which the women gave them to understand that the satrap was not at home, but was away a parasang further on. As it was late they entered with the water carriers within the stockade to visit the headman of the village. Accordingly Chrysippus and as many of the troops as were able got into cantonments there, while the rest of the soldiers, those namely who were unable to complete the march, had to spend the night out, without food and without fire. Under the circumstances, some of the men perished. On the heels of the army hung perpetually bands of the enemy, snatching away disabled baggage animals and fighting with each other over their carcasses. And in its track not seldom were left to their fate disabled soldiers struck down with snow blindness or with toes mortified by frostbite. As to the eyes, it was some alleviation against the snow to march with something black before them. For the feet, the only remedy was to keep in motion without stopping for an instant, and to loose the sandal at night. If they went to sleep with the sandals on, the thong worked into the feet, and the sandals were frozen fast to them. This was partly due to the fact that, since their old sandals had failed, they wore untanned brogues made of newly flayed ox hides. It was owing to some such dire necessity that a party of men fell out and were left behind, and seeing a black-looking patch of ground where the snow had evidently disappeared, they conjectured it must have been melted, and this was actually so, owing to a spring of some sort which was to be seen steaming up in a dell close by. To this they had turned aside and sat down, and were loath to go a step further. But Xenophon, with his rearguard, perceived them, and begged and implored them by all manner of means not to be left behind, telling them that the enemy were after them in large packs pursuing, and he ended by growing angry. They merely bade him put a knife to their throats, not one step further would they stir. Then it seemed best to frighten the pursuing enemy if possible, and prevent their falling upon the invalids. It was already dusk, and the pursuers were advancing with much noise and hubbub, wrangling and disputing over their spoils. Then all of a sudden the rearguard, in the plenitude of health and strength, sprang up out of their lair and run upon the enemy, whilst those weary wights bawled out as loud as their sick throats could sound, and clashed their spears against their shields, and the enemy in terror hurled themselves through the snow into the dell, and not one of them ever uttered a sound again. Xenophon and his party, telling the sick folk that next day people would come for them, set off, and before they had gone half a mile, they fell in with some soldiers who had laid down to rest on the snow with their cloaks wrapped round them, but never a guard was established, and they made them get up. Their explanation was that those in front would not move on. Passing by this group, he sent forward the strongest of his light infantry in advance, with orders to find out what the stoppage was. They reported that the whole army lay reposing in such fashion. That being so, Xenophon's men had nothing for it but to bivouac in the open air also, without fire and supperless, merely posting what pickets they could under the circumstances. But as soon as it drew towards day, Xenophon dispatched the youngest of his men to the sick folk behind, with orders to make them get up, and force them to proceed. Meanwhile, Chrysippus had sent some of his men quartered in the village to inquire how they fared in the rear. They were overjoyed to see them, and handed over the sick folk to them to carry into camp, while they themselves continued their march forward, and ere 20 furlongs were passed, reached the village in which Chrysippus was quartered. As soon as the two divisions were met, the resolution was come to that it would be safe to billet the regiments throughout the villages. Chrysippus remained where he was, while the rest drew lots for the villages in sight, and then, with their several detachments, marched off to their respective destinations. It was here that Polycrates, an Athenian and captain of a company, asked for leave of absence. He wished to be off on a quest of his own, and putting himself at the head of the active men of the division, he ran to the village which had been allotted to Xenophon. He surprised within it the villagers with their headmen, and 17 young horses which were being reared as a tribute for the king, and, last of all, the headman's own daughter, a young bride only 8 days wed. Her husband had gone off to chase hares, and so he escaped being taken with the other villagers. The houses were underground structures with an aperture like the mouth of a well by which to enter, but they were broad and spacious below. The entrance for the beasts of burden was dug out, but the human occupants descended by a ladder. In these dwellings were to be found goats and sheep and cattle, and cocks and hens, with their various progeny. The flocks and herds were all reared under cover upon green food. There were stores within of wheat and barley and vegetables, and wine made from barley in great big bowls. The grains of barley malt lay floating in the beverage up to the lip of the vessel, and reeds lay in them, some longer, some shorter, without joints. When you were thirsty, you must take one of these into your mouth and suck. The beverage, without admixture of water, was very strong, and of a delicious flavour to certain palates, but the taste must be acquired. Xenophon made the headman of the village his guest at supper, and bade him keep a good heart. So far from robbing him of his children, they would fill his house full of good things in return for what they took before they went away. Only he must set them an example, and discover some blessing or other for the army, until they found themselves with another tribe. To this he readily assented, and with the utmost cordiality showed them the cellar where the wine was buried. For this night then, having taken up their several quarters as described, they slumbered in the midst of plenty, one and all, with the headman under watch and ward, and his children with him safe in sight. But on the following day Xenophon took the headman and set off to Chrysippus, making a round of the villages, and at each place turning in to visit the different parties. Everywhere alike he found them faring sumptuously and merry-making. There was not a single village where they did not insist on setting a breakfast before them, and on the same table were spread 6 dishes at least: lamb, kid, pork, veal, fowls, with various sorts of bread, some of wheat and some of barley. When, as an act of courtesy, anyone wished to drink his neighbour's health, he would drag him to the big bowl, and when there he must duck his head and take a long pull, drinking like an ox. The headman, they insisted everywhere, must accept as a present whatever he liked to have, but he would accept nothing except where he espied any of his relations, when he made a point of taking them off, him or her, with himself. When they reached Chrysippus they found a similar scene. There too the men were feasting in their quarters, garlanded with wisps of hay and dry grass, and Armenian boys were playing the part of waiters in barbaric costumes, only they had to point out by gesture to the boys what they were to do, like deaf and dumb. After the first formalities, when Chrysippus and Xenophon had greeted one another like bosom friends, they interrogated the headman in common by means of the Persian-speaking interpreter. What was the country? They asked. He replied, Armenia. And again, for whom are the horses being bred? They are tribute for the king, he replied. And the neighbouring country? Is the land of the Chalybes, he said, and he described the road which led to it. So for the present Xenophon went off, taking the headman back with him to his household and friends. He also made him present of an oldish horse which he had got. He had heard that the headman was a priest of the sun, and so he could fatten up the beast and sacrifice him. Otherwise he was afraid it might die outright, for it had been injured by the long marching. For himself he took his pick of the colts, and gave a colt apiece to each of his fellow generals and officers. The horses here were smaller than the Persian horses, but much more spirited. It was here too that their friend the headman explained to them how they should wrap small bags or sacks around the feet of the horses and other cattle when marching through the snow, for without such precautions the creatures sank up to their bellies. Number 6. When a week had passed, on the 8th day Xenophon delivered over the guide, that is to say the village headman, to Chrysippus. He left the headman's household safe behind in the village, with the exception of his son, a lad in the bloom of youth. This boy was entrusted to Episthanes of Amphipolis to guard. if the headman proved himself a good guide, he was to take away his son also at his departure. They finally made his house the repository of all the good things they could contrive to get together. Then they broke up their camp and commenced to march, the headman guiding them through the snow unfettered. When they had reached the third stage, Cheirisophus flew into a rage with him, because he had not brought them to any villages. The headman pleaded that there were none in this part. Cheirisophus struck him, but forgot to bind him, and the end of it was that the headman ran away in the night and was gone, leaving his son behind him. This was the sole ground of difference between Cheirisophus and Xenophon during the march, this combination of ill-treatment and neglect in the case of the guide. As to the boy, Episthanes conceived a passion for him, and took him home with him, and found in him the most faithful of friends. After this, they marched 7 stages at the rate of 5 parasangs a day, to the banks of the river Phasis, which is 100 feet broad, and thence they marched another couple of stages, 10 parasangs. But at the pass leading down into the plain there appeared in front of them a mixed body of Chalybes and Touchians and Phasianians. When Cheirisophus caught sight of the enemy on the pass at a distance of about 3 or 4 miles, he ceased marching, not caring to approach the enemy with his troops in column, and he passed down the order to the others, to deploy their companies to the front, that the troops might form into line. As soon as the rear guard had come up, he assembled the generals and officers, and addressed them. "The enemy, as you see, are in occupation of the mountain pass. It is time we should consider how we are to make the best fight to win it. My opinion is, that we should give orders to the troops to take their morning meal, whilst we deliberate whether we should cross the mountains today or tomorrow." "My opinion," said Cleonor, "is that as soon as we have breakfasted, we should arm for the fight and attack the enemy without loss of time, for if we fritter away today, the enemy who are now content to look at us will grow bolder, and with their growing courage, depend upon it, others more numerous will join them." After him, Xenophon spoke. "This," he said, "is how I see the matter. If fight we must, let us make preparation to sell our lives dearly. But if we desire to cross with the greatest ease, the point to consider is, how we may get the fewest wounds and throw away the smallest number of good men. Well then, that part of the mountain which is visible stretches nearly 7 miles. Where are the men posted to intercept us? Except at the road itself, they are nowhere to be seen. It is much better to try if possible to steal a point of this desert mountain unobserved, and before they know where we are, secure the prize, than to fly at a strong position and an enemy thoroughly prepared, since it is much easier to march up a mountain without fighting than to tramp along a level when assailants are at either hand, and provided he has not to fight, a man will see what lies at his feet much more plainly even at night than in broad daylight in the midst of battle, and a rough road to feet that roam in peace may be pleasanter than a smooth surface with the bullets whistling about your ears. Nor is it so impossible, I take it, to steal a march, since it is open to us to go by night, when we cannot be seen, and fall back so far that they will never notice us. In my opinion, however, if we make a feint of attacking here, we shall find the mountain chain all the more deserted elsewhere, since the enemy will be waiting for us here in thicker swarm." "But what right have I to be drawing conclusions about stealing in your presence, Cheirisophus? For you Lacedaemonians, as I have often been told, you who belong to the peers, practice stealing from your boyhood up, and it is no disgrace, but honourable rather to steal, except such things as the law forbids, and in order, I presume, to stimulate your sense of secretiveness, and to make you master thieves, it is lawful for you further to get a whipping if you are caught. Now then, you have a fine opportunity of displaying your training, but take care we are not caught stealing over the mountain, or we shall catch it ourselves." "For all that," retorted Cheirisophus, "I have heard that you Athenians are clever hands at stealing the public moneys, and that too though there is a fearful risk for the person so employed. But, I am told, it is your best men who are addicted to it, if it is your best men who are thought worthy to rule. So it is a fine opportunity for yourself also, Xenophon, to exhibit your education." "And I," replied Xenophon, "am ready to take the rear division, as soon as we have supped, and seize the mountain chain. I have already got guides, for the light troops laid an ambuscade, and seized some of the cut-purse vagabonds who hung on our rear. I am further informed by them that the mountain is not inaccessible, but is grazed by goats and cattle, so that if we can once get hold of any portion of it, there will be no difficulty as regards our animals. They can cross. As to the enemy, I expect they will not even wait for us any longer, when they once see us on a level with themselves on the heights, for they do not even at present care to come down and meet us on fair ground." Charissippus answered, "But why should you go and leave your command in the rear? Send others rather, unless a band of volunteers will present themselves." Thereupon Aristonymus the Methydrian came forward with some heavy infantry, and Nicomachus the Oetian with another body of light troops, and they made an agreement to kindle several watch-fires as soon as they held the heights. The arrangements made, they breakfasted, and after breakfast Charissippus advanced the whole army 10 furlongs closer towards the enemy, so as to strengthen the impression that he intended to attack them at that point. But as soon as they had supped and night had fallen, the party under orders set off and occupied the mountain, while the main body rested where they were. Now as soon as the enemy perceived that the mountain was taken, they banished all thought of sleep, and kept many watch-fires blazing through the night. But at break of day Charissippus offered sacrifice, and began advancing along the road, while the detachment which held the mountain advanced pari passu by the high ground. The larger mass of the enemy, on his side, remained still on the mountain pass, but a section of them turned to confront the detachment on the heights. Before the main bodies had time to draw together, the detachment on the height came to close quarters, and the Hellenes were victorious and gave chase. Meanwhile the light division of the Hellenes, issuing from the plain, were rapidly advancing against the serried lines of the enemy, whilst Charissippus followed up with his heavy infantry at quick march. But the enemy on the road no sooner saw their higher division being worsted than they fled, and some few of them were slain, and a vast number of wicker shields were taken, which the Hellenes hacked to pieces with their short swords, and rendered useless. So when they had reached the summit of the pass, they sacrificed, and set up a trophy, and descending into the plain, reached villages abounding in good things of every kind. End of Book 4, Part 3. Book 4, Part 4 of Xenophon's Anábasis. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrew Coleman. Anábasis by Xenophon. Translated by H.G. Dakins. Book 4, Part 4. Number 7. After this, they marched into the country of the Chauchians 5 stages, 30 parasangs, and provisions failed. For the Chauchians lived in strong places, into which they had carried up all their stores. Now when the army arrived before one of these strong places, a mere fortress, without city or houses, into which a motley crowd of men and women and numerous flocks and herds were gathered, Charissippus attacked at once. When the first regiment fell back tired, a second advanced, and again a third, for it was impossible to surround the place in full force, as it was encircled by a river. Presently Xenophon came up with the rearguard, consisting of both light and heavy infantry, whereupon Charissippus halted him with the words, "In the nick of time you have come. We must take this place, for the troops have no provisions unless we take it." Thereupon they consulted together, and to Xenophon's inquiry, what it was which hindered their simply walking in, Charissippus replied, "There is just this one narrow approach which you see, but when we attempt to pass it by, they roll down volleys of stones from yonder overhanging crag," pointing up, "and this is the state in which you find yourself if you chance to be caught," and he pointed to some poor fellows with their legs or ribs crushed to bits. "But when they have expended their ammunition," said Xenophon, "there is nothing else, is there, to hinder our passing? Certainly, except yonder handful of fellows, there is no one in front of us that we can see, and of them, only 2 or 3 apparently are armed, and the distance to be traversed under fire is, as your eyes will tell you, about 150 feet, as near as can be, and of this space the first 100 is thickly covered with great pines at intervals. Under cover of these, what harm can come to our men from a pelt of stones, flying or rolling? So then there is only 50 feet left to cross during a lull of stones." "Ay," said Chrysippus, "but with our first attempt to approach the bush, a galling fire of stones commences." "The very thing we want," said the other, "for they will use up their ammunition all the quicker. But let us select a point from which we shall have only a brief space to run across, if we can, and from which it will be easier to get back, if we wish." Thereupon Chrysippus and Xenophon set out with Callimachus the Parrhasian, the captain in command of the officers of the rear guard that day. The rest of the captains remained out of danger. That done, the next step was for a party of about 70 men to get away under the trees, not in a body, but one by one, every one using his best precaution, and Agassiz the Stymphalian, and Aristonomus the Methydrian, who were also officers of the rear guard, were posted as supports outside the trees, for it was not possible for more than a single company to stand safely within the trees. Here Callimachus hit upon a pretty contrivance. He ran forward from the tree under which he was posted 2 or 3 paces, and as soon as the stones came whizzing, he retired easily, but at each excursion more than 10 wagon loads of rocks were expended. Agassiz, seeing how Callimachus was amusing himself, and the whole army looking on as spectators, was seized with the fear that he might miss his chance of being first to run the gauntlet of the enemy's fire and get into the place. So, without a word of summons to his neighbour Aristonomus, or to Eurylochus of Lucia, both comrades of his, or to any one else, off he set on his own account, and passed the whole detachment. But Callimachus, seeing him tearing past, caught hold of his shield by the rim, and in the meantime Aristonomus the Methydrian ran past both, and after him Eurylochus of Lucia, for they were one and all aspirants to valour, and in that high pursuit each was the eager rival of the rest. So, in this strife of honour, the 3 of them took the fortress, and when they had once rushed in, not a stone more was hurled from overhead. And here a terrible spectacle displayed itself. The women first cast their infants down the cliff, and then they cast themselves after their fallen little ones, and the men likewise. In such a scene Aeneas the Stymphalian, an officer, caught sight of a man with a fine dress about to throw himself over, and seized hold of him to stop him, but the other caught him to his arms, and both were gone in an instant headlong down the crags, and were killed. Out of this place the merest handful of human beings were taken prisoners, but cattle and asses in abundance, and flocks of sheep. From this place they marched through the Chalybes 7 stages, 50 parasangs. These were the bravest men whom they encountered on the whole march, coming cheerily to close quarters with them. They wore linen cuirasses reaching to the groin, and instead of the ordinary wings, or basques, a thickly plaited fringe of cords. They were also provided with greaves and helmets, and at the girdle a short sabre, about as long as the Laconian dagger, with which they cut the throats of those they mastered, and after severing the head from the trunk, they would march along carrying it, singing and dancing, when they drew within their enemy's field of view. They carried also a spear 15 cubits long, lanced at one end. This folk stayed in regular townships, and whenever the Hellenes passed by, they invariably hung close on their heels fighting. They had dwelling places in their fortresses, and into them they had carried up their supplies, so that the Hellenes could get nothing from this district, but supported themselves on the flocks and herds they had taken from the Tauchians. After this, the Hellenes reached the river Harpasus, which was 400 feet broad. Hence they marched through the Scythenians 4 stages, 20 parasangs, through a long level country to more villages, among which they halted 3 days, and got in supplies. Passing on from thence in 4 stages of 20 parasangs, they reached a large and prosperous well-populated city, which went by the name of Gymnias, from which the governor of the country sent them a guide to lead them through a district hostile to his own. This guide told them that within 5 days he would lead them to a place from which they would see the sea, and, he added, "If I fail of my word, you are free to take my life." Accordingly, he put himself at their head, but he no sooner set foot in the country hostile to himself than he fell to encouraging them to burn and harry the land. Indeed, his exhortations were so earnest, it was plain that it was for this he had come, and not out of the good will he bore the Hellenes. On the 5th day they reached the mountain, the name of which was Theches. No sooner had the men in front ascended it and caught sight of the sea than a great cry arose, and Xenophon, in the rearguard, catching the sound of it, conjectured that another set of enemies must surely be attacking in front, for they were followed by the inhabitants of the country, which was all aflame. Indeed, the rearguard had killed some, and captured others alive by laying an ambuscade. They had taken also about 20 wicker shields, covered with the raw hides of shaggy oxen. But as the shout became louder and nearer, and those who from time to time came up began racing at the top of their speed towards the shouters, and the shouting continually recommenced, with yet greater volume as the numbers increased, Xenophon settled in his mind that something extraordinary must have happened. So he mounted his horse, and taking with him Lycias and the cavalry, he galloped to the rescue. Presently they could hear the soldiers shouting, and passing on, the joyful word, "The sea! The sea!" Thereupon they began running, rearguard and all, and the baggage animals and horses came galloping up. But when they had reached the summit, then indeed they fell to embracing one another, generals and officers and all, and the tears trickled down their cheeks. And on a sudden, someone, whoever it was, having passed down the order, the soldiers began bringing stones and erecting a great cairn, whereon they dedicated a host of untanned skins, and staves, and captured wicker shields, and with his own hand the guide hacked the shields to pieces, inviting the rest to follow his example. After this the Hellenes dismissed the guide with a present raised from the common store, to wit, a horse, a silver bowl, a Persian dress, and 10 darics. But what he most begged to have were their rings, and of these he got several from the soldiers. So, after pointing out to them a village where they would find quarters, and the road by which they would proceed towards the land of the Macrones, as evening fell, he turned his back upon them in the night, and was gone. Number 8. From this point the Hellenes marched through the country of the Macrones 3 stages, 10 parasangs, and on the 1st day they reached the river, which formed the boundary between the land of the Macrones and the land of the Scythenians. Above them, on their right, they had a country of the sternest and ruggedest character, and on their left another river, into which the frontier river discharges itself, and which they must cross. This was thickly fringed with trees, which, though not of any great bulk, were closely packed. As soon as they came up to them, the Hellenes proceeded to cut them down in their haste to get out of the place as soon as possible. But the Macrones, armed with wicker shields and lances and hair tunics, were already drawn up to receive them opposite the crossing. They were cheering one another on, and kept up a steady pelt of stones into the river, though they failed to reach the other side, or do any harm. At this juncture one of the light infantry came up to Xenophon. He had been, he said, a slave at Athens, and he wished to tell him that he recognized the speech of these people. "I think," said he, "that this must be my native country, and if there is no objection, I will have a talk with them." "No objection at all," replied Xenophon. "Pray talk to them, and ask them first who they are." In answer to this question they said, "They were Macrones." "Well then," said he, "ask them why they are drawn up in battle and want to fight with us." They answered, "Because you are invading our country." The generals bade him say, "If so, it is not with intention certainly of doing it or you any harm, but we have been at war with the king, and are now returning to Hellas, and all we want is to reach the sea." The others asked, were they willing to give them pledges to that effect? They replied, yes, they were ready to give and receive pledges to that effect. Then the Macrones gave a barbaric lance to the Hellenes, and the Hellenes a Hellenic lance to them, for these, they said, would serve as pledges, and both sides called upon the gods to witness. After the pledges were exchanged, the Macrones fell to vigorously hewing down trees and constructing a road to help them across, mingling freely with the Hellenes and fraternizing in their midst, and they afforded them as good a market as they could, and for 3 days conducted them on their march, until they had brought them safely to the confines of the Colchians. At this point they were confronted by a great mountain chain, which however was accessible, and on it the Colchians were drawn up for battle. In the first instance the Hellenes drew up opposite in line of battle, as though they were minded to assault the hill in that order, but afterwards the generals determined to hold a council of war and consider how to make the fairest fight. Accordingly Xenophon said, "I am not for advancing in line, but advise to form companies by columns. To begin with, the line," he urged, "would be scattered and thrown into disorder at once, for we shall find the mountain full of inequalities. It will be pathless here and easy to traverse there. The mere fact of first having formed in line and then seeing the line thrown into disorder must exercise a disheartening effect. Again, if we advance several deep, the enemy will none the less overlap us and turn their superfluous numbers to account as best they like, while, if we march in shallow order, we may fully expect our line to be cut through and through by the thick rain of missiles and rush of men, and if this happen anywhere along the line, the whole line will equally suffer. No, my notion is to form columns by companies, covering ground sufficient with spaces between the companies to allow the last companies of each flank to be outside the enemy's flanks. Thus we shall, with our extreme companies, be outside the enemy's line, and the best men at the head of their columns will lead the attack, and every company will pick its way where the ground is easy. Also, it will be difficult for the enemy to force his way into the intervening spaces, when there are companies on both sides, nor will it be easy for him to cut in twain any individual company marching in column. If, too, any particular company should be pressed, the neighbouring company will come to the rescue, or if at any point any single company succeed in reaching the height, from that moment not one man of the enemy will stand his ground." This proposal was carried, and they formed into columns by companies. Then Xenophon, returning from the right wing to the left, addressed the soldiers. "Men," he said, "these men whom you see in front of you are the sole obstacles still interposed between us and the haven of our hopes so long deferred. We will swallow them up whole, without cooking, if we can." The several divisions fell into position, the companies were formed into columns, and the result was a total of something like 80 companies of heavy infantry, each company consisting on an average of 100 men. The light infantry and bowmen were arranged in 3 divisions, 2 outside to support the left and the right respectively, and the 3rd in the centre, each division consisting of about 600 men. Before starting, the generals passed the order to offer prayer, and with the prayer and battle hymn rising from their lips, they commenced their advance. Charispus and Xenophon, and the light infantry with them, advanced outside the enemy's line to right and left, and the enemy, seeing their advance, made an effort to keep parallel and confront them, but in order to do so, as he extended partly to right and partly to left, he was pulled to pieces, and there was a large space or hollow left in the centre of his line. Seeing them separate thus, the light infantry attached to the Arcadian battalion, under command of Aeschines, an Acarnanian, mistook the movement for flight, and with a loud shout rushed on, and these were the first to scale the mountain summit, but they were closely followed up by the Arcadian heavy infantry, under command of Cleanor of Orchomenus. When they began running in that way, the enemy stood their ground no longer, but betook themselves to flight, one in one direction, one in another, and the Hellenes scaled the hill and found quarters in numerous villages which contained supplies in abundance. Here, generally speaking, there was nothing to excite their wonderment, but the numbers of beehives were indeed astonishing, and so were certain properties of the honey. The effect upon the soldiers who tasted the combs was, that they all went for the nonce quite off their heads, and suffered from vomiting and diarrhoea, with a total inability to stand steady on their legs. A small dose produced a condition not unlike violent drunkenness; a large one, an attack very like a fit of madness, and some dropped down, apparently at death's door. So they lay, hundreds of them, as if there had been a great defeat, a prey to the cruellest despondency. But the next day none had died, and almost at the same hour of the day at which they had eaten, they recovered their senses, and on the third or fourth day got on their legs again like convalescents after a severe course of medical treatment. From this place they marched on 2 stages, 7 parasangs, and reached the sea at Trapezus, a populous Hellenic city on the Euxine Sea, a colony of the Sinopians, in the territory of the Colchians. Here they halted about 30 days in the villages of the Colchians, which they used as a base of operations to ravage the whole territory of Colchis. The men of Trapezus supplied the army with a market, entertained them, and gave them, as gifts of hospitality, oxen and wheat and wine. Further, they negotiated with them in behalf of their neighbours the Colchians, who dwelt in the plain for the most part, and from this folk also came gifts of hospitality in the shape of cattle. And now the Hellenes made preparation for the sacrifice which they had vowed, and a sufficient number of cattle came in for them to offer thank offerings for safe guidance to Zeus the Saviour, and to Heracles, and to the other gods, according to their vows. They instituted also a gymnastic contest on the mountainside, just where they were quartered, and chose Dracontius, a Spartan, who had been banished from home when a lad, having unintentionally slain another boy with a blow of his dagger, to superintend the course, and be president of the games. As soon as the sacrifices were over, they handed over the hides of the beasts to Dracontius, and bade him lead the way to his race course. He merely waved his hand, and pointed to where they were standing, and said, "There, this ridge is just the place for running, anywhere, everywhere." "But how," it was asked, "will they manage to wrestle on the hard, scrubby ground?" "Oh, worse knocks for those who are thrown," the president replied. There was a mile race for boys, the majority being captive lads, and for the long race more than 60 Cretans competed. There was wrestling, boxing, and the Pancration. Altogether it was a beautiful spectacle. There was a large number of entries, and the emulation, with their companions, male and female, standing as spectators, was immense. There was horse racing also. The riders had to gallop down a steep incline to the sea, and then turn and come up again to the altar, and on the descent more than half rolled head over heels, and then back they came, toiling up the tremendous steep, scarcely out of a walking pace. Loud were the shouts, the laughter, and the cheers. End of Book 4.